Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Abandoned Puppet Theater. Chapter 1: The Discovery. Holly Arnold was an antique dealer by trade, but it was her love of history that had led her to this peculiar profession. The Isle of Wight was a haven for the forgotten relics of time, an island steeped in history, mystery, and legends that whispered through the winds. Holly had always found solace in the rustle of old paper, the creak of engine wood, and the glint of tarnished silver. Each item she encountered told a story, and she was determined to listen. It was on a chilly autumn afternoon that Holly stumbled upon the theatre. She had been wandering the outskirts of a small, nearly deserted village at the island's edge, following rumors of an estate sale with treasures yet untouched by modern hands. The forest path, carpeted with fallen leaves, led her to a structure she hadn't seen on any map, an old, crumbling building with a faded sign that read, Brimstone Puppet Theatre. The name sent a shiver down her spine, but Holly was not one to be easily deterred. Her curiosity piqued, she pushed open the creaking door, and it groaned in protest as it swung inward. Inside, the theatre was a shadow of its former self. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Rows of tattered seats faced a small stage, where heavy velvet curtains hung limply, their deep red color now faded to a sickly brown. Holly's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Behind the stage, she found them rows upon rows of marionettes, some slumped over as if abandoned mid-performance, others still hanging from their strings, frozen in grotesque poses. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she moved through the room. Holly's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the figures. One marionette, in particular, caught her eye. It was larger than the others, dressed in a tattered Victorian gown with delicate lace trimming. Its face was eerily lifelike, painted with a delicate hand, though time had worn away much of its beauty. The puppet's eyes were a striking blue, and its lips were curled into a knowing smile. As Holly reached out to touch the marionette, a sudden gust of wind blew through the theatre, rustling the curtains and sending a cloud of dust swirling into the air. She jumped back, startled, but her hand had already brushed against the puppet's cold, wooden hand. The moment their hands touched, the theatre seemed to come alive. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped sharply. Holly's breath fogged in front of her as she looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The marionettes began to move, their limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. The sound of wood creaking and joints clicking filled the room, a symphony of the unnatural. Holly backed away, her heart racing, but she was unable to tear her gaze away from the stage. The marionettes were moving in unison now, their movements deliberate and eerily synchronized. They danced and twirled, their glassy eyes fixed on Holly as they performed their grotesque ballet. A voice, soft and childlike, whispered in her ear, "Stay and play with us, Holly." She spun around, but there was no one there. The theatre was empty, save for the puppets that now seemed to crowd closer to the edge of the stage, their expressions twisted into mockeries of joy and sorrow. Holly knew she needed to leave, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. The marionette's movements grew faster, more frenzied, as if driven by some unseen force. The voice whispered again, this time more insistent, "Stay with us forever." Panic surged through her, and she finally found the strength to move. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty theatre as she fled back into the forest. The whispers followed her, growing louder until they were a chorus of voices, pleading, begging, demanding. Holly didn't stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling, and finally managed to start the engine. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the outline of the theatre, now dark and silent once more. The marionette stood in the doorway, watching her with unblinking eyes. Chapter 2: The Haunting. For days after her visit to the Brimstone Puppet Theatre, Holly couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing there. At night, she heard faint whispers and the creak of wooden joints, as if the marionettes had followed her home. Sleep eluded her, and when she did manage to doze off, her dreams were plagued by visions of the theatre. In her nightmares, she was back on the stage, surrounded by the puppets, their strings tangled around her limbs, pulling her into their dance. The voice, soft and childlike, would whisper in her ear, "Join us, Holly, we need you." Each morning she woke drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, that the theater had simply unnerved her, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as she was closing up her shop, Holly noticed something strange. A marionette, one she had never seen before, was sitting on the counter. It was small, no more than a foot tall, and its face was painted with a mischievous grin. Its eyes were a striking blue, just like the puppet she had touched in the theater. Holly's heart skipped a beat. She was certain she hadn't brought the puppet into her shop, yet there it was, staring up at her with that unsettling smile. She reached out to pick it up, but as her fingers brushed against its wooden body, the lights in the shop flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and Holly's breath caught in her throat. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the shop. "Stay with us, Holly, play with us." Holly backed away from the counter, her heart racing. The air grew cold, and she felt their presence behind her. Slowly she turned around, her pulse hammering in her ears. There, standing in the shadows, were the marionettes from the theater. They were larger now, their limbs elongated and twisted, their faces distorted into grotesque parodies of human expressions. They moved toward her, their wooden feet clattering on the floor, their strings trailing behind them like cobwebs. Holly stumbled back, her mind racing for a way out. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass candlestick, and swung it at the nearest puppet. The marionette shattered upon impact, its wooden pieces scattering across the floor, but the others continued to advance, undeterred. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Join us, Holly, we need you." Holly turned and ran for the door, but the marionettes were faster. Their strings wrapped around her legs, tripping her, and she fell to the floor with a thud. The puppets swarmed over her, their wooden hands grasping at her, pulling her down. She screamed, thrashing against them, but their grip was relentless. The room spun around her, and the world faded to black. Chapter 3: The Return. When Holly awoke, she was back in the theater. The stage lights were on, casting an eerie glow over the rows of empty seats. She was lying on the stage, her limbs tangled in the marionette strings. The puppets stood around her, their faces expressionless, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. She tried to move, but the strings held her fast. Panic surged through her as she realized she was no longer in control of her own body. The marionettes began to move, their limbs jerking in a grotesque dance, and Holly's body moved with them, her limbs pulled by invisible strings. She struggled, but it was no use. The puppet's grip was too strong. They spun her around the stage, her body moving in time with their unnatural rhythm. The whispers filled her ears, drowning out her thoughts. "You're one of us now, Holly, forever." Tears streamed down her face as she realized the truth. She was trapped, a puppet in the theater's eternal performance, her strings controlled by the vengeful spirits that haunted the marionettes. As the dance continued, Holly's mind began to slip away, lost in the endless cycle of movement and whispers. She was no longer Holly Arnold, antique dealer and lover of history. She was just another puppet in the Brimstone Puppet Theater, her soul bound to the stage for all eternity. The theater stood silent and dark once more, its secrets hidden from the world. But if you listened closely on a still, moonlit night, you might hear the faint sound of wooden feet clattering on the stage, and the soft, childlike whisper of a voice inviting you to join the dance. But beware, once you step into the Brimstone Puppet Theater, you may never leave. Chapter 4: The Visitor. Years passed, and the Brimstone Puppet Theater faded further into obscurity. The village nearby, already sparse in population, continued to dwindle as its few remaining residents moved away or succumbed to old age. The theater, hidden deep in the woods, became little more than a local legend, a ghost story told to children on cold, stormy nights to keep them from wandering too far into the forest. But legends have a way of drawing the curious, and the theater did not remain undisturbed for long. One summer, a young filmmaker named Daniel Reeves arrived on the Isle of Wight. He was known for his documentary work on haunted locations, and his latest project was to explore the lesser-known supernatural sites of England. The Brimstone Puppet Theater, with its dark history and mysterious disappearances, was a perfect subject for his film. Daniel had heard the stories how the theatre had been abandoned after the original puppeteer, a man named Alistair Grange, had vanished without a trace along with his entire troupe of performers. Locals whispered of vengeful spirits, cursed puppets, and strange lights seen in the woods at night. Intrigued, Daniel decided to investigate. The trek to the theatre was arduous, the forest path overgrown with brambles and vines. But Daniel pressed on, his camera equipment strapped to his back, his heart racing with anticipation. As he finally broke through the undergrowth, the theatre loomed before him, just as the locals had described it: decayed, silent, and ominous. Undeterred by the dilapidated exterior, Daniel set up his camera outside the theatre, recording his initial impressions. The building was eerie in its stillness, its windows dark and uninviting. But Daniel had seen worse. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The musty scent of decay hit him immediately. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, disturbed only by his movements. The interior was just as he had imagined: rows of tattered seats, a small stage, and heavy curtains that appeared ready to disintegrate at the slightest touch. But it was the marionettes that drew his attention. They hung from their strings, just as the stories had described, lifeless yet somehow menacing, their glassy eyes fixed on the intruder. Daniel shivered as he panned his camera across the stage, capturing the strange, unsettling atmosphere of the place. "These are incredible," Daniel murmured to himself, moving closer to one of the larger puppets. It was dressed in a Victorian gown, its features eerily lifelike despite the wear of time. Almost human. As he reached out to adjust the puppet's position for a better shot, he felt the cold gust of wind brush past him. The curtains fluttered, and for a moment the room seemed to grow darker. Daniel frowned, pulling his jacket tighter around him. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and the once still air was now thick with a sense of foreboding. Ignoring the chill, Daniel continued to film, his excitement growing as he imagined the final cut of his documentary. The footage would be incredible, haunting, atmospheric, and undeniably eerie. But as he moved from puppet to puppet, something began to gnaw at the edge of his consciousness, a growing awareness that he was not alone. The marionettes, once still, now seemed to shift in the dim light. Their eyes, dull and glassy, appeared to follow his every move. Daniel paused, staring at one of the puppets. Had its head tilted slightly? He shook his head, dismissing thought as a trick of the light. But then he heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper was soft, almost childlike, and it seemed to be coming from behind the stage. "Join us," the voice whispered. "Stay with us." Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned off the camera and stood in the silence, listening. The theatre was dark, the only light coming from the small flashlight he had attached to his camera. He scanned the room, his pulse quickening. There was no one there, just the puppets hanging silently from their strings. Determined to capture whatever was happening, Daniel switched the camera back on and slowly approached the stage. The whispering grew louder as he neared the curtains, a chorus of voices, each more insistent than the last. "Join us, Daniel, stay forever," the words echoed in his mind, drowning out rational thought. His hands trembled as he pulled back the curtains, revealing the backstage area. It was cluttered with old props, broken furniture, and more marionettes, their strings tangled and twisted. At the far end of the room, Daniel noticed a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in dust and grime. But as he approached, the dust seemed to melt away, revealing a reflection that was not his own. In the mirror, he saw the stage as it had been in its heyday, grand and opulent, the seats filled with an eager audience. On the stage stood Alistair Grange, the puppeteer, his face a mask of concentration as he manipulated the marionettes in a mesmerizing dance. But something was wrong. Grange's eyes were wide with terror, his movements frantic as if he were fighting against the strings. And then Daniel saw them, dark, shadowy figures that loomed behind Grange, their hands pulling the strings, controlling the puppets. They were the true masters of the theatre, and they had their eyes on him now. Panic surged through Daniel as the figures in the mirror turned their gaze toward him, their expressions unreadable. He stumbled back, but his reflection remained, frozen in place, its eyes wide with fear. The mirror shattered, and Daniel felt the searing pain in his chest. He looked down to see strings thin, glimmering threads emerging from his skin, wrapping around his limbs, tightening with every movement. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness that engulfed him. Chapter 5: The New Puppet. When Daniel awoke, he was no longer in control of his body. He stood on the stage, his limbs stiff and unresponsive, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He could see the theater, its seats empty, its walls crumbling, but he could not move. His body was not his own. The marionettes surrounded him, their strings intertwined with his. They moved in unison, and he moved with them, a grotesque parody of life. He could feel the strings pulling at his joints, guiding his every movement, and the whispers filled his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. "You're one of us now, Daniel," the voices cooed. Forever, he wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but no sound escaped his lips. He was a puppet now, a marionette in the Brimstone Puppet Theatre, his soul bound to the cursed stage. The faces of the marionettes, once lifeless and wooden, now seemed to smile with a knowing malice. He recognized some of them, their faces twisted and distorted, but still familiar. They were the others who had come before him, drawn by the theatre's dark allure, only to be trapped, just as he was. The theatre was alive with the sound of clicking wood and creaking joints as the marionettes began their dance, and Daniel was forced to join them. His movements were no longer his own, guided by the invisible strings that controlled his every step. The dance was intricate, a performance honed over centuries, and he was merely the latest addition to the troupe. As the dance continued, Daniel felt his consciousness slipping away, consumed by the rhythm of the marionette's movements and the relentless whispers that echoed through the theatre. He was no longer Daniel Reeves, the filmmaker. He was just another puppet, another lost soul, doomed to dance forever in the Brimstone Puppet Theatre. Outside, the night grew darker, and the wind howled through the trees. The theatre stood silent once more, its secrets hidden from the world. But inside, the dance continued, the marionettes moving in perfect harmony, their glassy eyes fixed on the stage. And in the center of it all was Daniel, his body jerking and twisting as he performed his part in the eternal play. The whispers had become a part of him now, a constant presence in his mind, and he knew that there was no escape. The Brimstone Puppet Theatre had claimed another victim, and it would wait patiently for the next curious soul to stumble upon its stores, eager to add another puppet to its collection. Chapter 6: The Final Act. Months passed, and the small village on the Isle of Wight grew even quieter. The local innkeeper, a grizzled old man named Tom, noticed that the filmmaker who had rented a room from him had never returned. Daniel Reeves had vanished without a trace, just like so many others before him. Tom had warned him, of course told him the stories, shared the legends, but the young man had brushed it off as superstition. Tom shook his head sadly, knowing what had likely happened. One night, as a storm raged outside, a knock came at Tom's door. It was a young woman, drenched and shivering from the rain. She introduced herself as Claire, Daniel Reeves' sister. She had come to the Isle of Wight searching for her brother, desperate to find out what had happened to him. Tom's heart sank as he listened to her story. He knew that Daniel was likely gone forever, another victim of the cursed theatre. But he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, not yet. Instead, he offered her shelter for the night and promised to help her in the morning. As Claire settled into her room, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her since she arrived on the island. She had found Daniel's notes in his apartment, sketches of the Brimstone Puppet Theatre, fragments of the local legends, and a cryptic entry about joining the dance. The theatre seemed to be at the center of his disappearance, and Claire was determined to uncover the truth. The next morning, despite the heavy clouds and a threat of rain, Claire set out for the theatre. Tom tried to dissuade her, his warnings growing more urgent, but Claire was resolute. She had to find her brother, no matter the cost. The forest path to the theatre was even more overgrown than Daniel had described in his notes. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out much of the daylight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As she walked, Claire felt the weight of the forest pressing in on her, as if it were trying to swallow her whole. When she finally reached the theatre, it appeared as if it had been waiting for her. The building stood in the same eerie silence that Daniel had described, its facade crumbling and overgrown with ivy. But now Claire noticed something more. There was a faint light flickering inside, just beyond the door. With her heart pounding in her chest, Claire pushed open the door and stepped inside. The musty scent of decay hit her immediately, and she had to stifle a cough. The interior was just as Daniel had described, but more oppressive than she had imagined. The rows of tattered seats, the heavy velvet curtains, and the marionettes hanging from their strings all seemed to exude a malevolent energy. Claire felt the shiver run down her spine as she approached the stage. The marionettes were still, their glassy eyes fixed on her, but she could sense the malevolence behind their lifeless gazes. Her breath caught as she recognized one of the larger puppets. It was the same one Daniel had written about, the one with the lifelike face and the striking blue eyes. She reached out, hesitating for only a moment before touching the puppet's hand. The air grew colder instantly, and the room darkened. Claire could feel the presence of something ancient and angry, a force that had been waiting for her, just as it had waited for Daniel. The marionettes began to move, their strings jerking as they came to life. The sound of creaking wood and clicking joints filled the theater, and the whispers started a chorus of voices, soft and insistent. "Join us, Claire. Stay with us." She recoiled, her pulse racing as she stepped back from the stage. But the marionettes continued to advance, their movements more deliberate, more synchronized. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "Daniel," she cried out, hoping beyond hope that her brother might somehow hear her. In response, one of the marionettes stepped forward, its movements stiff and unnatural. Claire's eyes widened in horror as she recognized her brother's face, twisted and distorted, but undeniably his. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth fixed in a silent scream, and his body jerked as if pulled by invisible strings. Ugh. The voice that emerged was barely more than a whisper, strained and broken, but it was unmistakably Daniel's. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she reached out to him. "Daniel, I'm here. I'll get you out of this, I promise." But Daniel's marionette form only shook its head, the movement stiff and jerky. No escape. Trapped. Forever. The other marionettes began to close in, their hands reaching out for Claire. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to leave her brother behind. Desperation surged within her as she searched the room for anything that might help, anything that could break the hold these vengeful spirits had over him. Her eyes fell on the ornate mirror at the back of the stage, now cracked and covered in a thin layer of dust. Daniel had mentioned this mirror in his notes, how it seemed to show a different version of the theater, a glimpse into the past where the spirits of the marionettes were trapped. Perhaps she thought the mirror was the key. With a surge of adrenaline, Claire rushed to the mirror. She grabbed a nearby piece of broken wood and smashed it against the surface, shattering the glass into 1,000 tiny fragments. The moment the mirror broke, the whispers stopped and the marionettes froze in place. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything was silent. Then the fragments of the mirror began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. The light grew brighter, enveloping the theater in a warm, golden glow. The marionettes slowly lowered their arms, their strings falling away as if cut by an unseen hand. Claire watched in awe as the spirits began to rise from the puppets, their forms shimmering in the golden light. They hovered in the air for a moment, their faces serene and peaceful, before fading away, leaving the theater empty and still. Claire rushed to her brother's side, her heart pounding with hope. Daniel lay on the stage, his body no longer bound by the strings. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at her, dazed but alive. "Claire," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. You saved me." Tears of relief filled her eyes as she pulled him into a tight embrace. "I thought I lost you," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. Daniel smiled weakly, his body trembling from the ordeal. "We need to get out of here, before the theater changes its mind." Supporting each other, they stumbled out of the theater, the oppressive darkness lifting with each step. The moment they crossed the threshold, the old building began to crumble behind them, the walls collapsing in on themselves as if the very foundations of the theater had given up the fight. As they reached the edge of the forest, they turned back to watch the brimstone puppet theater disappear into a cloud of dust and debris. The dark legacy of the theater was finally at an end. Epilogue: The New Beginning. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and Claire returned to the mainland, their story met with skepticism and disbelief. But it didn't matter. They had survived, and the bond between them was stronger than ever. Daniel, shaken by his experience, decided to abandon his documentary work and start anew. He moved to a quiet town, far from the shadow of the theater, where he could heal and find peace. Claire stayed close, visiting often, ensuring her brother never felt alone again. The Brimstone Puppet Theatre became just another ghost story, its ruins reclaimed by the forest, its curse lifted. But Claire and Daniel knew the truth. They had seen the darkness that dwelt within, and they had survived. The marionettes, once instruments of terror, were now gone, their spirits freed from their wooden prisons. And yet, every so often, Claire would wake in the dead of night, haunted by the memory of the marionette's lifeless eyes, the whispers that had echoed through the theatre, and the moment she almost lost her brother forever. But each time she would remind herself that the theatre was gone, the spirits at rest, and that she and Daniel were safe. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees, Claire couldn't help but wonder if the theatre's curse was truly broken, or if it was simply waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon its remains, eager to add another puppet to its collection. For now, though, the Brimstone Puppet Theatre stood silent and empty, a relic of the past, its secrets buried beneath the weight of time. But legends, as Claire knew all too well, never truly die. They simply lie in wait, ready to rise again when the world has forgotten. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.